So usually what an author does when he goes out and speaks is talk about his own book. And I'm not going to do that. I want to sell you on this book. This book by Luigi Zingales. Luigi Zingales is an economist. He's a libertarian economist. He teaches at the University of Chicago Business School. He's also the author of a book with Raghuram Rajan called Saving Capitalism from the Capitalists. And what Zingales is focused on is what he thinks of as a signal threat to our political system, the threat of what he calls crony capitalism. Now, Zingales is pro-market, but as he explains, a market, of course, is made up of both business and consumers. And to be pro-market is not to be pro-business and anti-consumers any more than to be pro-market would be anti-business and pro-consumers. What pro-market means is pro-market. And the problem, Zingales believes, that we face in the American political system right now is that there is increasing ambiguity between being pro-market and being pro-business, aka cronyism. And he believes, and I think he's right, that that's just as bad as confusing pro-market with pro-consumer, as in Peronism. Both of these are bad, and this in particular is bad because the cronyism that we see today, Zingales fears, as an Italian, leads to the Peronism of countries like Argentina or other countries across the world. Because as we see the product, as he identifies, of this cronyism, splitting the people from a group that's not the people, we see the rise in movements like the Occupy Wall Street movement, which even after the presence of violence in that movement still could get the support of 48% of the American public for their ideals over the 30% who would oppose them. So in this book, which has literally just come out this week, Zingales goes through a number of ideas. Many of them will be familiar to people here. He pushes an idea called political antitrust, where he says the antitrust inquiry should think as much about market size and market concentration as the ability of market participants to co-opt the political system through crony capitalism. He argues strongly against subsidizing what he calls crony finance. He says end all bailouts, both the Democrats' version of that, Rubin's bailouts, and the GOP version of that, Greenspan's put and bailout, and the corruption of academics, which I'd love to go on forever talking about the way we academics have increasingly become simple tools hired by people to espouse particular policies rather than what is true, and embrace Pigou, or at least Pigouvian taxes, as a way to deal with what we all should recognize are important public goods and important public good problems. So I think this is an extraordinary work that I would compel anyone, if I could, to read, and I would commend you to pay attention to. But here's where I want to criticize what Luigi has done. Because Luigi betrays a certain blindness that I believe many on the libertarian right betray. And I want to introduce that blindness with perhaps the second most important philosopher from the 20th century, the great Steve Martin. So I'm sure some of you remember this joke. Let me just play a little bit of it.
You can be a millionaire and never pay taxes. You can have $1 million and never pay taxes. You say, Steve, how can I be a millionaire and never pay taxes? First, get $1 million. Now.
Okay, so that's the point, right? It's the fallacy of assuming away the hardest problem. Right? Get $1 million, okay. So the question here is, how are you going to get to the place that the libertarian argues we ought to get? How are we going to get there? And what I want to do in the beginning of this talk is to explain, to introduce exactly why that's an extremely hard problem to solve. because there's a clear sense of what the libertarian wants. Small government, simpler taxes, minimize crazy regulation. But what I want to convince you of is the way the current system makes it extremely hard for that libertarian to get small government, simpler taxes, the elimination of crazy regulation. So I want to introduce this through 3 examples. Some of you might be so tortured to know that this is the Communications Act of 1934. This act was amended eventually to have 6 titles. Title 2 deals with what we think of as telecom, like old-day telephones. Title 6 deals with cable. When Al Gore, just after he invented the internet, was thinking about how to make the regulatory environment for the internet flourish, he had the idea of taking the internet-related components of Title II and Title VI and bundling them into a new Title VII that would govern DSL for telecom and cable internet for what used to be under Title VI. And this new Title VII would be fundamentally deregulated. Minimal regulations, much less than anything anybody's talking about today with network neutrality or anything like that. But the idea was set this off, remove the old regulations of Title II and the regulations of Title VI, and build this into a new deregulated location that would encourage, as he thought, lots of new innovation and investment in this infrastructure. His chief staffer, who was running this idea, took it to Capitol Hill, and he reported back to me what the response he got from Capitol Hill was. And the response, as he summarized it, was, hell no. How are we going to raise money from the telecoms if we deregulate them? How are we going to raise money from the telecoms if we deregulate them? Right? The obvious intuition is, if you're in the business of extorting money, which is what congressional campaign fundraising is all about, extorting money from people, you need a wide range of people to extort money from. And if you shrink the range of people you are regulating, you shrink the number of people you can extort money from. And so if you're in the business of raising money to get back to Congress, you're not necessarily interested in the business of reducing the number of people you regulate, because that just makes it harder to get back to Congress. Or here's another example. Wall Street Journal a year ago was puzzled about the explosion of temporary tax code provisions. Tax code is filled with all these provisions that expire at a certain point, leading to what the journal called extender mania. And as this graph demonstrates, the number of extenders, meaning the extending of one of these temporary provisions, is going through the roof, and they couldn't quite figure out why this was. Now, it turns out temporary provisions are a gift to the tax code from Ronald Reagan. In 1981, the research and development tax credit was made temporary because Democrats and Republicans argued about whether it would work. Republicans said this would create lots of great investment that otherwise wouldn't be created. The Democrats said they didn't believe that would do that. So they said, let's have a temporary provision, and after a number of years, we'll ask the economists, did it work? And if the economists said it did work, then we'll make it permanent. If they didn't, we'll remove it. So after a number of years, they asked this question, did it work? And the answer was it did. It was a great tax credit idea. It spurred a kind of investment that otherwise would not have been made, the economists said, and so therefore it made sense absolutely to be part of our tax code. Here's the puzzle. It is still temporary. Still temporary. And why is it temporary? Well, as Rebecca Kaisar summarizes in this piece in the Georgia Law Review, the principal recipients of the research credit are large U.S. manufacturing corporations. These business entities are more than willing to invest in lobbying activities and campaign donations to ensure continuance of this large tax savings. Or the Institute for Policy Innovation puts it a little bit more sharply. This cycle has been repeated for years. Congress allows the credit to lapse until another short extension is given, preceded, of course, by a series of fundraisers and speeches about the importance of nurturing innovation. Congress essentially uses this cycle to raise money for re-election, promising industry more predictability the next time around. And the key is to recognize how this dynamic is increasingly central to how Washington works. We architect tax policy, or they architect tax policy, not just to raise revenue for the federal treasury, but also to make it easier to raise revenue for congressional campaigns, because these limited short-term tax benefits are just a simple reason for people the extorted to give money to these congressional candidates so that they can extend and renew these credits. So we ask the question, why not eliminate these temporary provisions, make them permanent to the extent that they make sense? Well, we can imagine an equivalent staffer to the one who worked for Al Gore coming back and saying, well, the answer I get on the Hill is, hell no. How are we going to raise money from the targets if we eliminate these temporary provisions? Okay, so you want simpler tax code? You want simpler tax system? You're fighting against an entrenched built-in incentive to keep the system as complicated as it possibly could be to make it easier to raise money. Or one final example. For many years, I worked in the area of copyright. October 27th, 1998, I became a copyright activist when the president signs into law a statute in honor of this great American, the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act. Okay, the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act extended the term of existing copyrights by 20 years. The question Congress was supposed to be asking when it passed this statute was, did it advance the public good to extend the term of an existing copyright by 20 years? Now, just think a little bit about what copyrights are for. Copyrights are government-granted monopolies necessary to create the incentive to produce great work. But the one thing we know about incentives is that they are prospective only. Not even the United States Congress can get George Gershwin to produce anything more. So when you ask the question, could it advance the public good to extend the term of an existing copyright, the answer is pretty obvious. No, it can't advance the public good, whatever private benefit it might deliver. And so when we took a challenge to this statute in the Supreme Court and got 13 economists, including 5 Nobel Prize winners, including this liberal left, this is Milton Friedman, right-wing libertarian Nobel Prize winning economist, to sign the brief, Friedman said he would sign the brief only if the word no-brainer was in the brief. So obvious was it that you couldn't advance the public good by extending the term of an existing copyright. But apparently there were no brains in this place when Congress unanimously extended the term of existing copyrights. What there was more than $6 million in contributions from the Disney Corporation and related interests eager to have their copyrights extended, the public good be damned. And so you can ask Congress, well, why don't you end this practice of extending existing copyrights? Congress has extended the terms of existing copyrights 11 times in the last 30 years. Why not end this practice of extending the term of existing copyrights? You can imagine the staffer coming back from the Hill reporting, we're getting the answer, how are we going to raise money from copyright holders if we stop this practice of extending the term of existing copyrights? Okay, now, all 3 of these cases display, I suggest, the same point. There is certainly a political economy to government, as economists like to think about it. But as well as a political economy to government, there is also a political economy to government reform. Now, liberals typically ignore the political economy of government. They just imagine we have a good idea, government will make it happen, and what conservatives have taught us is that many times the good intentions of government notwithstanding, the good doesn't come from what the government wants to make happen. But what I want to suggest is that libertarians too often ignore the political economy of government reform. The very activity of reforming government itself has a political economy. And if we don't understand that political economy, then we are going to be getting $1 million and not paying taxes by just imagining we have the $1 million. So we must understand both of these economies if we're going to understand how to make progress in making government function in a more sensible way. And I think at the core of both of these economies is a common problem. The common problem is this institution, and this institution is suffering from a profound corruption. Now, by corruption, I don't mean brown paper bags secreting cash among members of Congress. I don't mean Rob Blagojevich conception of corruption. I don't mean anybody violating any law. The corruption I'm talking about is a corruption relative to the framers' baseline of how this institution of Congress was to function. The framers gave us what they called a republic. By a republic, they said they meant a representative democracy. And by a representative democracy, as Federalist 52 describes, they said they meant a government that would have a branch that would be dependent upon the people alone. Okay, so here's their model of government. We have the people, we have the government. I do my own slides. It's cool the way that bounces like that, right? So the people and the government, creating this exclusive dependency. All right, here's the problem. Congress has evolved a different dependence. Increasingly, not a dependence just on the people, but more and more a dependence upon the funders. As members spend between 30 and 70% of their time raising money to get back to Congress or to get their party back into power, they develop, as any of us would, a sixth sense, a constant awareness about how what they do might affect their ability to raise money. They become, in the words of the X-Files, shape-shifters as they adjust their views in light of what they know will raise money, not necessarily on issues 1 to 10, but on issues 11 to 1,000, in light of what they know will help them to raise money. Leslie Byrne, a Democrat from Virginia, describes that when she went to Congress, she was told by a colleague, quote, always lean to the green. Then to clarify, she went on, he was not an environmentalist. Now the point is, this is a dependence too, but it is a different and conflicting dependence from the dependence the framers intended of a dependence upon the people alone because, surprise, surprise, the funders are not the people. 0.26% of America, I know you're thinking he's a lawyer, he doesn't know how to do fractions, but I really mean 0.26%, 1/4 of 1% of Americans give more than $200 in a congressional election. 0.05% max out to any candidate in a congressional election. 0.01, the 1% of the 1%, give more than $10,000 in an election cycle. And my favorite statistic here, 0.00063% have contributed 80% of the super PAC money that has been spent in the Republican primaries so far. That's 196 Americans have given 80% of the super PAC money spent in Republican primaries to date. So the Occupy Wall Street people are so proud of their, we are the 99%. It's bad marketing, bad marketing. They are the 99.74%, or the 99.95%, or 99.99%, or 99.999937%, depending upon which statistic you want to use to measure their relative lack of influence compared with those who are funding the elections. Now this produces a critical instability inside the way that this government is supposed to function. The framers gave us a republic that was built with checks and balances designed to slow reform. The whole purpose was to create lots of places to block the ability of government to legislate, so that when government legislated, we were pretty confident the people really believed in the legislation that passed. But in this system, we've created the perfect storm of blocking effective reform. Because now a tiny number of Americans can band together to block reform by simply dominating the fundraising in any particular election cycle. So a tiny number block reform, and reform, this is the critical point, on the left or on the right. This is a repeat of what basically the Articles of Confederation gave us, where one state could block anything Congress did. Now it's a tiny fraction of effectively one state that can block anything Congress would do. Now this is, Supreme Court doesn't get this yet, but they will get it eventually. This is a kind of corruption. It is a corruption of the dependence the framers intended our government to have. It is dependence corruption, even if it is not quid pro quo bribery corruption. And this corruption has an effect. First effect is it leads Americans to believe, and it's a separate question, but I believe Americans are right to believe, but let's focus on what Americans believe, that, quote, money buys results in Congress. In a poll we conducted for the book that I published last fall, we found that 75% of Americans believe money buys results in Congress. A little bit more Democrats than Republicans, but I guarantee you before the Republicans took control of the House, there were just as many Republicans as Democrats. So whether it's 2/3 or 3/4, here's the thing we all agree about. Money buys results in Congress. Leading to point number 2. That belief erodes trust in the institution of Congress. Last year, ABC and the New York Times reported that 9% of Americans have confidence in Congress. 9%. Right? You have to put this in some context. It is certainly the case that a higher percentage of Americans believed in the British Crown at the time of the Revolution than who believe in our Congress today. And that leads to point number 3. This low trust erodes participation. Rock the Vote, which registers and turns out young voters to elections, and in 2008 registered and turned out the largest number of young voters ever in the history of voting, found in 2010 that a significant number of their registrars were not going to turn out and vote, so they polled them to ask them why. Number one reason given by far, 2-to-1 over the second highest reason, was no matter who wins, corporate interests will still have too much power and prevent real change. And it's not just kids. The vast majority of Americans who could have voted in 2010 did not vote, in part, at least, because of this belief. This is the problem with American government today. It's a problem that is defined as corruption, and it's that corruption that is at the core of both reform of government and government policy making itself. Now, if that's the problem, I think it begs an obvious solution. There's a systemic problem here that the funders are not the people. There's a systemic solution, which is to make it so that the funders are the people. To give Congress away, I know that sounds like give Congress to somebody else. Nobody will take Congress, so I don't mean that. I mean it's that give Congress a way to fund without Faust, without selling their souls and thereby alienating most Americans from what they do. And the one way to do this, and I increasingly think the only way to do this, is to embrace something I want to call, quote, citizen-funded campaigns. Okay, now people are a little bit puzzled with what that means. I want to be careful in defining what I mean here. The internet notwithstanding, we have to accept the fact that campaigns need to be funded. We're not going to create zero-cost campaigns. The question is, funded by whom? Should they be funded by citizens or non-citizens? Non-citizens like the Chinese or the French, or whether or not corporations are persons. Nobody has ever said corporations are citizens of the United States. So when most Americans are presented with the question so framed, they say, okay, it should be citizens who fund campaigns. But if it's citizens, which citizens? Should it be some citizens or all citizens? Because you could say that we have a system of citizen-funded campaigns right now, but it's a system where only some citizens participate in funding the campaigns. They fund it through large dollar contributions, small percentage of Americans, the 0.26, the 0.05, the 0.01, funded by the tiniest slice of the 1%, evoking this image from the last progressive era of the way the democracy functions. So when I talk about citizen-funded campaigns, I don't mean that. Now this leads people to the opposite extreme, what we typically think of as public funding of campaigns. Systems like the Federal Election Commission's public funding of presidential elections, where the government decides how much you get to run your campaign and after you qualify writes you some big check. This system is hated by most Americans. It's hated first because there feels to be, both liberals and conservatives alike, feel something odd about the government controlling how much money I have to run a political campaign to get in and take over control of government. It just seems to be unconnected to the way elections should function. And conservatives in particular don't like public funding because it's a system where my money is being used to subsidize your speech. And there seems to be something particularly egregious in the context of political speech that you tax somebody to subsidize speech that person doesn't necessarily agree with. And everybody believes that the system is to become too bloated and bureaucratic to be effective, and therefore public support for public funding is at a very low point. So when I talk about citizen-funded campaigns, I don't mean public funding in its traditional sense. But I want you to recognize the way that there's, nicely left space between the private and the public here that points to a class of solutions that have characteristics that are better than both the some-funded private system and the all-funded public system. And I want to call these voluntary small-dollar funded campaigns. So these are systems that allow candidates to opt into a system where they take small contributions only, and they get amplified, these small contributions, so that they can afford to run successful campaigns with small contributions alone. There are many versions of this. Arizona has a version. Maine has a version. Connecticut is the most recent to adopt this version. When Connecticut adopted its version, 78% of elected representatives, Democrats and Republicans alike, opted into this small dollar funding system. And in Arizona, the strongest supporters of the public funding system turn out to be Tea Party patriot types who have used this to escape the traditional economically bound Republican Party. So there's lots of different kind of support for it. The effect of it, though, is that small dollar contributions are enough to win. These kinds of systems answer the first kind of criticism, because the amount of money you're getting is not being determined by some bureaucrat. The amount of money you're getting is determined by how many people you can convince to contribute to your campaign, amplified perhaps by the government, but not directly controlled. It doesn't answer the second criticism, which is the criticism of my money is being used to subsidize your speech. Because some of these systems are still so large that effectively there's a transfer from some people to other people that subsidizes their speech. So I took it as my challenge to say, is there a way to design a small dollar public funding system that respects this criticism and finds a way to avoid the charge that my money is being used to subsidize your speech? So in my book, I describe what I call the Grant and Franklin Project. So here's the way Grant and Franklin Project works. You have to start with the assumption, and I can show you the economic data to support it, but the assumption that every single voter contributes, in quotes, at least $50 to the federal treasury. Whether that's income tax or Social Security tax or payroll tax, whatever, all of us send at least $50 to the federal treasury. So we're all in it at least $50. So under this system, we say, let's rebate that first $50 that we send to the federal government. Let's get our money back in the form of a democracy voucher, like an education voucher, but a democracy voucher. And that democracy voucher I can use to give to any candidate who agrees to fund his or her campaign with democracy vouchers only, plus contributions of ordinary money limited to, let's say, $100 per citizen. So $50 voucher is Grant's, $100 contributions are Franklin's. Now, $50 per voter is $7 billion. The total amount raised and spent in 2010 in congressional elections was $1.8 billion. So that's 3 times the total amount raised in 2010. Means it's real money, but rather than this money coming from the tiniest fraction of the 1%, it's coming in a representative way from people across the political spectrum and across the income spectrum, meaning that citizen-funded elections in this sense is a kind of bottom-up system guaranteeing it's only citizens, but as many citizens as would participate, potentially all citizens who are driving the funding of elections, restoring us to the Federalists' conception of a system dependent upon the people alone, because the funding now, as well as the votes, is coming from the representative mix of the people alone. That's the problem that I set up, was corruption. This is what I want to mark as a solution to that problem, the citizen-funded elections. But it turns out this invites its own problem. Let's call this version 2 of the problem. Version 2 is much more difficult, because it's not even clear it's possible for our current Congress to enact reform like this. And this was driven home to me most powerfully by Representative Jim Cooper, who's a Democrat from Virginia, has been in Congress as long as about 20 other except about 20 other members of Congress. Cooper said to me, the thing you've got to understand about Capitol Hill is that Capitol Hill has become a, quote, farm league for K Street. Farm league for K Street, where the lobbyists work. He said, members and staffers and bureaucrats have an increasingly common business model in their head. A business model that's focused not on their work for the public in Congress, but focused on their life after government, their life as lobbyists. Public Citizen calculated between 1998 and 2004, 50% of the Senate left to become lobbyists, 42% of the House. Those numbers have only gone up. United Republic in April calculated that the average salary increase of a member becoming a lobbyist is 1,452%. So in a system where everybody on the Hill is imagining their life as a rich man after they leave Capitol Hill and work on K Street, we see that everybody on Capitol Hill depends upon this system surviving. So how could we ever imagine them voting the change necessary to bring about a change in this system? And to the extent there's a constitutional change that's required, how would we ever imagine 2/3 of them voting to bring about the change that this system would require? And I think the honest answer has got to be we can't. We can't imagine that on their own they would change this. They won't change this on their own. And that defines what I think of as the critical problem number 2. And that then begs what I want to say is solution number 2. The Chatterati say that the interesting division in American politics is between the left side and the right side. I think the interesting division in American politics is between the inside and the outside. The inside, the kind of inside the Beltway, Washington, D.C. politics, and the outside, the kind of rest of America politics. And when you listen to what the people on the inside talk about or think that America cares about, and what the rest of America talks about and actually does care about, to just borrow this title for a little bit, we could say that the inside is from Mars and that we are from Earth. Okay? Now, when you think about this inside and the outside, we recognize a certain kind of politics that's associated with each. And I want to say we recognize that the outside, let's have something we'll call exopolitics, the exopolitics of the outsiders in this political space. And this is a politics not of politicians. These are not like congressman wannabes who are participating in this exopolitics movement. These are instead citizen politicians, citizens demanding that their politics change. And when you look back over the last 14 years, I think we can see these repeated waves of open source exopolitics energy that has risen up using the infrastructure of the internet to demand important fundamental changes. So I think the first of these was in 1998 with Move On, when America all of a sudden realized that Congress, the insiders, was about to impeach a president on the basis of the president lying about having sex with an intern. And Americans began to say, well, wait a minute, there might be other problems that America should be focused on. So 2 programmers in Berkeley put together a technology to begin to build a list of people that demand Congress move on from this issue. And within a couple of weeks, millions of people, Republicans and Democrats alike, had joined this move on list to say Congress should move on, censure the president, and move on to something important. And it was the first time that we saw this extraordinary explosion of grassroots power from the infrastructure that the internet produced. I think the Tea Party in 2009, at least the Tea Party Patriots, were a genuine exopolitics movement, grassroots movement enabled by this infrastructure that could begin to coordinate and produce enormous power and political effectiveness because of the facility that this infrastructure had built. I think the Occupy movement is a similar example. I think the blocking of the SOPA-PIPA legislation, this legislation pushed by Hollywood, that Hollywood believed absolutely there was no chance they would ever be defeated and was defeated at the beginning of this year, is an example of the enormous power of this exopolitical movement. But we have to understand something fundamental about these exopolitical movements. They can't be commanded. At most, they can be nudged. They might be encouraged, but you should think of this as the politics of body surfing, right? You've got to stand there and wait for the right wave, and once it comes, you need to feed it and respect it and encourage it, but you can't demand that it appear, and you can't turn this extraordinary energy into something active until there's a reason that people feel motivated to actually step forward and do something about it. Now, if I ask the question, is there hope in our ability to actually bring about the change to the corruption I'm talking about, I think the hope is here. I think it is in this exopolitics movement. And that's what I would call solution number 3. But then as a final round, solution 3 begs its own problem 3. This corruption is going to require a constitutional solution. Not necessarily an Article 5 constitutional solution. What I mean by a constitutional solution is a fundamental change to our system, a fundamental change, whether through legislation or through the Constitution. There has been one time in our history where we have tried a fundamental change to our system without building an effective cross-partisan movement to support it. That one time was the Civil War. So that's not a good precedent to embrace for thinking about this fundamental change to our system. Every other time that we've had a fundamental change to our system, it has been a cross-partisan movement. And I don't mean by that bipartisan, where we all get together and sing Kumbaya and pretend we all believe in what each other talks about. I mean instead a movement that cuts across partisan lines, But here's the problem. The exopolitical movement that we've got right now, bubbling up in many different ways across the internet, is fundamentally polarized. Like everyone, like politicians, like parties, like the media, like .orgs that support these movements. We all practice this politics, this business model of polarization, business model that recognizes we get the most members, we get the most clicks, we get the most contributions, we get the most viewers to the extent we teach each other how to hate the other side. Everybody profits from the more we divide. We become a kind of Ray-Ban culture, polarized but very, very cool. Okay? So this is a problem in itself, this architecture of polarization inside our system. Oh, I've got my versions wrong. I'm sorry. That's going to invite whatever the numbers should be. But this is the final solution, I promise. Here, solution number 3 or 4. Can we find a way to get us beyond this us versus them? To get it beyond this kind of polarization? And I say that that begins with a certain kind of recognition. And that recognition, I take inspiration from Thoreau, 1846, and on Walden. Thoreau writes, "There are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil to one who is striking at the root." Okay, I want you to think about that one. I want you to call that one a root striker. Okay? So what a root striker sees in the current political environment is that if you step back from whatever mix of issues that you care about and connect the dots, whether it's healthcare reform on the left or government bailouts on the right, global warming on the left or complex tax system on the right, financial reform on the left or financial reform on the right, regardless of your mix of issues, what the root striker recognizes is that we will have no change in any of these issues until we change this corruption first. But today, our political system is living in this conspiracy of silence around this issue. Neither side in this presidential debate is going to raise the issue of this corruption once. Neither side is going to say anything about it because both sides depend so fundamentally upon it continuing in order for them to win their election. So the question is, how can we force it back into the center here? What can we do? In this closing, I'm going to just pick 3 things that I think can be done. Number 1, this exopolitical movement needs to change in an important way. It needs to think about building an alliance that focuses on common ground. So an alliance. That means a diverse yet cross-partisan group. So think of an alliance like this, not of an alliance like that. Right? Or for us, imagine the alliance of groups like this that could stand together and push for common political change. But the only way that happens is if you get these different kinds of groups to focus on a common ground. That's not common end. I don't think we have a common end across these different groups. But what we have is a common enemy. The common enemy is this root of corruption. It is this picture of the way this democracy has been corrupted, because the dependency here is not the dependency of a representative democracy inside of a republic. So to the extent we can focus this cross-partisan movement on this corruption and begin to exercise the power of the exopolitical movement, that's one step towards putting the pressure on Washington to change it. Second, we have to do more to make the recognition of this corruption manifest, to make it visible and make a commitment to reform visible. So we've just begun a project to this anti-corruption pledge, which you can get to at anticorruptionpledge.org, where you can signal the particular reforms that you think are essential, whether it's ending the revolving door or finding a way to citizen fund elections. And then when we get a significant number of people who have made a commitment to that kind of reform, the technology turns it around and pushes it back to the representative from that district and says, 50,000 people in your district have made a commitment to this reform. What pledge will you make? Taking Grover Norquist's idea and trying to update it to this type of technology. And if you make it visible and force it back into the center of the political debate, you make it at least possible for the promises necessary to bring about these reforms to happen. And finally, number 3, maybe the most controversial here. So Article 5 is the provision in our Constitution to facilitate amendment. But when the framers were talking about Article 5, they faced a puzzle. The standard way that had been suggested was Congress propose amendments and the states ratify them. But one question was raised: what if Congress is itself the problem? And so the suggestion was we needed a way around Congress if Congress is the problem. So built into Article 5 is a second way to initiate the process of an amendment. The second way is for the states to call for a convention. The convention then considers and proposes amendments, and the amendments are then sent out to the states to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. This is an Article 5 convention, not a constitutional convention. Its power is defined by Article 5, not the power of a generic constitutional convention. It is simply a procedure for proposing amendments. It's not a procedure for amending itself. Now, never before in the history of the United States have we had an Article 5 convention, but we came close once. 1911, when most people focused on the United States Senate as the core of the corruption in that then corrupt system of government, people were trying to force Congress to elect the Senate rather than appoint the Senate. Congress refused to bring about elections to the Senate. So there was a project to bring enough states to have ratification calls for a convention to force Congress to call a convention. And when the states were one state shy of enough states to force Congress to call a convention, they terrified Congress. And Congress began to think, what the hell are they going to do if there's a convention? What kind of craziness is going to come out of that convention? So at that point, Congress had the incentive necessary to get them to send an amendment out to the states to change the problem that was the problem of Congress. So Congress's refusal changed to Congress agreeing to fix the Senate. That was the 17th Amendment. Now, I think the same point should be recognized here. The interesting politics of a convention is that people can call for a convention for any reason at all. Some states can call for a balanced budget. There's a strong conservative movement to get limits on debt and balanced budget amendments into the Constitution. Other people can be calling for the purpose of fixing the corruption of Congress. Doesn't matter what the reasons are. If 34 states make the call, there has to be a convention. And we can use that process, which is a state-by-state process, local representatives making the decision to ratify this call, to increase the pressure on the center to change the system enough to make it so people don't think that there's a problem here to be solved. And maybe you get a convention out of that. But even if you don't get a convention, I'm increasingly of the view this is the only possible means within the political structure we've got right now to produce the pressure that's necessary to bring about that change. Okay, there's the argument. Here's how we pulled it together. So I say that what we need here is a new kind of exopolitics. That new kind of exopolitics is supposed to push us to something like citizen-funded elections. We need citizen-funded elections in order to push us back to a system dependent upon the people alone. We need a system dependent upon the people alone to get us back to a representative democracy, which is what the framers thought the republic would be. And through that process, to thereby starve the problem Luigi Zingales is focused on, the problem of the crony capitalist. Now, this is not a problem that is the new problem of our age. It is the problem that has been conceived to be the problem for all time. Indeed, when Franklin was carried from the convention, 1787, he was stopped on the street by a woman who said, "Mr. Franklin, what have you wrought?" Franklin's response was, "A republic, madam, but if you can keep it." And by a republic, he meant a representative democracy. And by a representative democracy, he meant a government with a branch dependent upon the people alone. We have to recognize that we have lost Franklin's republic. But we have to do something now. We have to do everything now, I believe, to find a way to fix it. Thank you very much. Happy to take your questions.